Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. And as you can probably imagine, we're going to devote the whole hour tonight to the horrific far-right riots that have been taking place across England and Northern Ireland. I have to say as well, I'm really delighted to have Ash Sarkar back on the show. Ash, when sort of Gary told me it was Ash back on tonight's show, I was relieved because I really wanted to get your take on the horrific scenes we've seen over the past 48 hours, or in fact 6 days now.
It feels very weird, doesn't it? You come back in time just for some really lovely race riots. I'd maybe hoped for a bit of August silly season, Michael. But you really did save the good stuff for me.
Far-right riots continued over the weekend and show no signs of stopping this week. Prime Minister Keir Starmer held an emergency Cobra meeting today, after which he said this.
I had a Cobra meeting this morning, which was an opportunity that I took to thank the police for their work over the last few days, to express my support for the police officers who have been injured and the communities impacted by this mindless thuggery. There are a number of actions that came out of the meeting. The first is we will have a standing army of specialist officers, public duty officers, so that we'll have enough officers to deal with this where we need them. The second is we'll ramp up criminal justice. There have already been hundreds of arrests. Some have appeared in court this morning. I've asked for early consideration of the earliest naming and identification of those involved in the process, who will feel the full force of the law. And thirdly, I've been absolutely clear that the criminal law applies online as well as offline, and I'm assured that that's the approach that is being taken. Whatever the apparent motivation, this is not protest, it is pure violence, and we will not tolerate attacks on mosques or our Muslim communities. So the full force of the law will be visited on all those who are identified as having taken part in these activities.
So it's that phrase, a standing army of specialist officers, which has sort of been the headline from the reaction from the government today. It's slightly odd. I mean, obviously, because some people are saying they should bring in the army because they've lost control of the streets. And you're saying we're bringing in an army, but it's an army of police officers. A little bit odd. I suppose potentially a sort of Keir Starmer type triangulation. The Prime Minister is also facing pressure to recall Parliament. However, when asked whether he would do that in that interview, he said, his priority is keeping Britain's streets safe and bringing justice to the people who've been out rioting. Around 400 people have been arrested across the UK so far. Ash, we're going to look over in detail at the appalling scenes of far-right rioting across England and Northern Ireland in a moment, so sort of the weekend's events. Today's events have obviously been more focused in Westminster and the political response. What have you made of Keir Starmer's response today? Are you reassured by what's come out of that Cobra meeting?
The short answer is no. There was one very conspicuous word that was absent from that clip, Michael, and it was the word racist. Because when you say this is criminality, this is mindless thuggery, you obscure the hatred and the ideology which is driving these attacks on people of colour, on Muslims, on asylum seekers, on migrants up and down the country. And that is racial hatred. And if you're a person of colour in this country and you're looking towards the government for decisive action, for protection, and they can't even use the word racist when taxi drivers are being pulled out of their cabs and beaten on camera, then it doesn't fill you with confidence. I think consistently across this entire crisis, Keir Starmer has been lackluster. He has been slow. I don't think that he's gotten on the front foot the way that he might have had we been seeing disorder prompted because of a death in police custody or something of that nature. Compare the government's response here to the response to the 2011 riots sparked by the killing of Mark Duggan. Obviously, the scale is different. I'm not saying that the scale is exactly the same, but you don't get the sense that this is a government that feels like this is a national crisis.
And obviously people on the right are making sort of the opposite argument. They're saying there's two-tier policing and the police are being tougher on the right than they are on people who aren't on the right. I mean, compared to the London riots, it does seem quite extraordinary how long this has been going on for, because I think the cops had it sort of under control after about 4 days in 2011. So the fact that, people are still scared that their local communities and their mosques are going to get attacked. I suppose, the government would say we've got a lot of areas to cover. These aren't concentrated sort of riots or pogroms at times. So they can say, we don't know where to concentrate our people to. But I don't think they have reassured the public yet. Let's look at some of the appalling scenes we've seen this weekend. So after a night of violence in Sunderland on Friday, Saturday saw unrest in many cities across England and Northern Ireland. Anti-fascist protesters faced off with far-right rioters in Bristol and Liverpool. Rioters smashed the windows of a hotel housing asylum seekers in Hull, dragged an Asian man out of his car while shouting, "Kill them," and ransacked shops. In Belfast, fascists from Northern Ireland and the Republic marched together, leading to a rather bizarre display of far-right unity. And rioters smashed windows at a cafe, and 2 people in the city were arrested outside of a mosque as they threw missiles at media workers. The racist violence continued on Sunday. Crowds in Middlesbrough attempted to stop traffic and ask drivers, "Are you white?" only allowing them through if they were. Others rampaged through the city's residential streets, smashing the windows of houses and cars.
What area of Middlesbrough in the town? It's in the town where all the not white people live.
Just so terrifying to see that kind of violence focused on people's residential homes. It's just, when people say, the BLM riots, whatever, throwing a brick through someone's residential home is just, I think it's on another level. It was scenes in Rotherham, though, that became a focal point of the afternoon that led to the Prime Minister having to issue a statement. Their far-right rioters surrounded a hotel housing asylum seekers. A video taken by a migrant from inside the hotel shows a man in a balaclava threatening those inside by pointing at them and then drawing his hand across his throat. The rioters were seen breaking the windows of the building while yelling things like "Get them out, Yorkshire in England," making monkey noises and telling those inside to run.
Stamped over, it's stamped over. We've tipped over the boiling point here. Fucking hell. They're in there. Go in there! Come on! Fuck my life.
Oh shit, man, they're in. They're in. Oh wow.
Where are you bastards?
They're in! Fucking hell! They are we're upstairs at last. Get out! Get out!
The rioters then attempted to set the building on fire.
That fire's going now, there's no point in that.
12 police officers were injured. Thankfully, nobody inside the hotel was injured, but they were attacked and are now left terrified. The Times have spoken to some of the 130 asylum seekers inside the hotel who faced 10 rioters marauding through the building. One told of how he was hit by the intruders until the police drove them away down the corridor. They also have this from another of those attacked, a 55-year-old Palestinian. I was taking some tea when they ran down swearing. A shirtless man was shouting and making so much noise they broke the windows. There were 8 on my floor, the first floor. I can't imagine how terrifying that would be. A 27-year-old asylum seeker from Botswana said this: "I wanted to cry. Maybe if they met me somewhere like in the shop, they'll do something bad to me. I'm scared to go out of the hotel. I mean, you'd probably be scared to stay in the hotel as well at this point if people are trying to burn it down. Sky News report that 4 asylum seekers who returned to the hotel at the time of the riot decided to sleep in the woods that night. That's according to security guards. After the unrest, hundreds of volunteers joined cleanup efforts in Rotherham and Middlesbrough and numerous anti-racist demonstrations across the country, while in Blackpool, far-right troublemakers had a bad time after they ran into attendees of a punk festival. But overall, the picture is an extremely bleak one. Those images of sort of throwing bricks through people's residential homes and then setting a hotel on fire while it contains lots of people. I mean, we're moving into the realms of sort of attempted murder here. This is not the kind of riot which we've seen in recent history. This does seem like we're reaching something on a different level, which is far more terrifying.
I mean, I almost don't know how openly to speak here, because on the one hand, I want to be a journalist and I want to offer dispassionate analysis of what's going on. And on the other, I'm a person of colour living in this country. And I'm looking at these images where people are quite serious about wanting to burn asylum seekers to death. I'm seeing video of a child holding her mother's hand, dancing down the street in Northern Ireland, chanting, "Packies out, Packies out." I'm seeing video of a black man attacked in the centre of Manchester by a whole gang of white racist thugs. And I'm asking myself the same questions that people of colour up and down the country are asking themselves, which is, how safe are we here? How strong are the bonds of belonging, the consensus around being a multiracial, multicultural society? Will they be strong enough to keep us safe in the long run? And for the first time, I'm saying, I don't know. I feel that things could get worse. I mean, there's some really important context here, which is that the far right have been emboldened, and they're emboldened by their timing. Just before those brutal, awful Southport murders, you had a Tommy Robinson march attended by thousands. I think the Southport murders coming so quickly after that meant they were active and it meant that they were organised. But they wouldn't have spread the way that they have unless there were significant numbers of disaffected locals who aren't part of the organised far right, who do feel an intense sense of racist resentment towards people of colour and migrants in their community. And that's why they're doing what they're doing. Now, I don't think for a minute that what we're seeing in Middlesbrough or in Rotherham or in Tamworth, that's representative of the communities as a whole. I don't think that it's representative of white people as a whole. I think what's much more representative of the sort of average morality of the country is those images of people coming out to clear up their community, and they're coming out and they're black and they're white and they're Asian and they're doing it together. But what concerns me is that we're in a moment where the far right, if they're organised enough, could build something like the kind of street violence infrastructure that we had in the bad old days of the 70s and the 80s with the National Front. The National Front contested the streets of East and South London. They made it unsafe for Black and Asian children to go to school. And what my worry is that we might see similar things in parts of the UK where the far right have been able to exploit local tensions around race, ethnicity, immigration, and asylum. That's the thing that's really, really worrying me at the moment. And I can't help but feel intensely emotional about it, because this is my home. This is the only home I have ever known. And while the far right love to find these out of context clips or tweets where they crop out the context where it makes it clear that I'm joking, I am British and I do belong here. And that's how everyone else feels as well. This is our home and we deserve to feel safe here, just like everyone else does.
You tweeted something that this weekend that I thought was really important. You're saying, because these people keep getting called anti-immigration protesters. And clearly these are far-right rioters. They're not protesters. They're not protesting. But also, this doesn't really, it's the thing that sparked this was a tragic murder by a young man. And initially, there were these lies spread that he'd come over on a small boat or he was a recent immigrant. He's not. He was born in Wales, but he happened to have Rwandan parents. And if that is a cause for riots, that does mean that, this isn't about immigration. This is about race, because the perpetrator wasn't a migrant, but they were non-white. And if a non-white person committing a crime can spark all of these riots, then it's very clear that this is a race issue, not an immigration issue. I just want to get your comments on that, Ash, because I know you sort of tweeted about that this weekend.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And this isn't just something which is being spread in far-right, Telegram channels. I mean, Matt Goodwin, in his piece written about these race riots, defined the suspect in the Southport murders as a child of Rwandan immigrants. Now, if that's his defining feature, that means that none of us are really British, even if we're born here, even if we're British nationals, even if we've got a British passport, even if this is the only home we've ever known. I mean, how many generations do you define someone as a descendant of immigrants for? And are we going to start applying that to white people too? I know plenty of white descendants of immigrants whose parents came from Ireland or whose parents came, from France or anywhere else in Europe. They don't get held to that same standard because they're not wearing it on their skin. And that's what's so important to point out. And I'm really glad you made the point, Michael, that these aren't anti-immigration protests. They're not anti-immigration riots. They're race riots. The targets are people of color, whether they're British, whether they're foreign-born, whether they're Asian, whether they're Black, whether they're Muslim, whether they're not. This is an attack on ethnic minorities in this country as a generalized whole.
Obviously, everyone is sort of hoping that these will be controlled by the cops, or that they'll sort of run out of steam. Unfortunately, there could be more to come. So according to anti-fascist research group Red Flare, far-right organisers on social media have listed 39 potential targets for disorder this week. The list says they won't stop coming until you tell them no more immigration, mask up. It lists migration-related charities, advice centres and solicitors among the targets for 8 p.m. on Wednesday. Now, one would hope that that's enough warning for the police to properly protect all of those places. I think this is a message which sort of has been seen on very large Telegram groups. It should be accepted as a given that rioters marauding the streets, throwing bricks at mosques and attacking people of colour are beyond the pale. They should be arrested, locked up, and they should have nothing to do with the broader political debate in this country. But not all politicians believe that's all there is to it. An extraordinary intervention was made this weekend by the country's most senior police and crime commissioner. Donna Jones is the Tory Police and Crime Commissioner for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight and the chair of the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners. After rioters threw bricks at mosques and burnt down libraries, she released this statement. The government must acknowledge what is causing this civil unrest in order to prevent it. Arresting people or creating violent disorder units is treating the symptom and not the cause. The question these people want answering, what is the government's solution to mass uncontrolled immigration? How are the new Labour government going to uphold and build on British values? This is the biggest challenge facing Sir Keir Starmer's government, and it's bitten quickly. Other Tory politicians have responded with silence, notably former Home Secretary Suella Braverman, who called peaceful pro-Palestine demonstrations hate marches, hasn't tweeted at all since these actually violent and hateful riots kicked off. As for reform and Nigel Farage, well, he was one of the highest profile figures originally sharing disinformation about the tragic Southport killings, which led, of course, to the riots in Southport. And late last week, he would give only the weakest condemnation of rioters.
So the Prime Minister tonight reacting to what has happened over the course of the last 48 hours. His conclusion, very simple, it's all the far right, as if they're causing all of the problems. No, the far right are a reaction to fear, to discomfort, to unease that is out there shared by tens of millions of people. Let me be clear. I don't support street violence. I don't support thuggery in any way at all. But I'm worried not just about the events in Southport, but about societal decline that is happening in our country. Law and order, folks, on our streets is breaking down.
Again, sort of, I don't support violent protests, but, they are right. That's essentially the message from an MP who, as I said, before those Southport riots, was saying, are the police hiding something from us? Is this someone who was on a terror watch list? All stuff that turned out to be completely false. right? Really, really whipping it up and then say, oh, but by the way, I don't support violent protest. One Labour politician has also come under particular scrutiny. Sarah Edwards is the MP for Tamworth. She posted this video last week, so before the riots across England broke out.
In Tamworth, the Holiday Inn has been used for asylum purposes for years, and the simple reality is that residents want their hotel back. Tamworth benefits from local tourism, and as I have said before in this chamber, the Holiday Inn should be for holidays. I therefore welcome today's announcement that the Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Bill includes plans to end asylum hotel use. It was great to host the then Shadow Home Secretary in Tamworth earlier this month to brief her on the situation, and I look forward to working with her in the coming weeks to discuss the issue in greater detail.
Just 4 days after Edwards posted that, this happened to the Holiday Inn in Tamworth. So that was the Tamworth Hotel being set on fire. Of course, the MP has condemned the attack. So she said this: the scenes in Tamworth tonight of violence are shocking and disgraceful and still ongoing. Thank you to Staffordshire Police for ensuring the safety of hotel staff and guests. And this will not be tolerated in our town. The police officers on the ground have my fullest support. The fact of her having publicised the hotel as housing asylum seekers has led to calls for her to resign, though. Ash, I suppose sort of a number of things to talk about here. You've got this Tory Police and Crime Commissioner. You've got the Reform MPs who are really egging this on, I think. And then you've got these Labour MPs. You know, I sometimes think it's a bit more borderline there. I think in this case, it obviously was, she shouldn't have sort of named the hotel in Parliament, but I would be wary of saying anyone who has complained about hotels in their constituency, sort of warehousing asylum seekers, it's terrible policy, obviously, is complicit. But there are clearly lots of people who are egging on the riots and people who should have been a lot more careful than they actually were.
Again, I don't know how to phrase this because I feel so angry about it. Let me start with Sarah Edwards. I do think that there is a difference. Of course, there's a difference between Reform MPs like Nigel Farage, who made it their mission to turn asylum hotels into real sites of fixation and loathing for the far right. That's what he spent much of 2020, 2021 doing. He would go down to the south coast. He would film himself looking at the small boats. He would go to asylum hotels. He would film himself doing exactly that too. He turned these things into, you know, almost memes, right? So asylum hotels, small boats, they become so loaded with meaning that they become targets. And the mainstream press and the mainstream politicians in both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party followed in his wake by adopting that framing. So yes, that's a different level of responsibility and coordination that someone like Nigel Farage has compared to someone like Sarah Edwards. Sarah Edwards, I think, though, has demonstrated an unforgivable level of stupidity, which is unfortunately representative of many of her colleagues within the Labour Party. Because I had a look at the election results for Tamworth. Reform came a close third. They were not that far behind the Conservative Party. That's obviously where she was looking when she's sort of glancing over her shoulder and being like, okay, well, if I raise a question about asylum hotels, maybe that's enough to try and keep Reform off my back, at the next general election. But that's exactly the kind of, short-termist, very narrowly political thinking, which has allowed asylum seekers and immigrants more generally to be demonized. And of course, there are thousands of articles written, there are hundreds of statements being made in Parliament, hundreds of MPs who, would never dream, ever of condoning violence or explicit racism or the disorder of the kind that we've seen over the last few days. But they're more than happy to participate in a much broader, sort of social and political phenomenon of only talking about immigration and only talking about asylum seekers as a problem. And every time you hear this story, it's the same story. There's too many of them. They're criminal. We don't like them here. They're causing problems. They are a problem. They just need to be somewhere else. There's always too many of them. It doesn't matter what the number is. It's always too many. And Sarah Edwards has participated in that. And the unforgivable stupidity, of course, was saying which hotel it was. Now, I'm sure that locally, the far right would have known that already. But maybe, just maybe, it'd have been a bit less of a target had she not brought that up in Parliament. And maybe what politics needs are fewer politicians who just go along with the xenophobic, tide and direction of the discourse and are able to talk about asylum seekers and immigrants in a different way. Actually brave politicians with a bit of spine. Sarah Edwards is not that. No spine to be found. And she should resign just for that, to be honest.
I mean, I think naming the hotel was silly and some of the language she used was silly. But I think it might well be the case that sort of in that constituency, there's sort of a widespread feeling that they don't like having asylum seekers warehoused there while they're not being processed. Because obviously the Labour position was we shouldn't be housing so many people in us. I think the really unforgivable thing here basically was the Conservatives talking about migration as if it was an existential threat and then bringing migration levels to record numbers and then also housing asylum seekers in often quite poor towns in very visible locations, which to me was just an absolute recipe for disaster. And I think that is different from what the Labour politicians are saying, where they sort of seem to be saying, something needs to be done about this, where the Conservatives were really proactively saying, this is an existential threat, but we're going to keep doing it. Almost actually using the language of we can't help. But I do think the Tories have a lot more responsibility here than Labour. We will come back to this a bit later in the show, Ash, but I'll give you sort of a word on this as well before we move on to the media.
One final thing to say, which is that dispersal, which is the policy of putting asylum seekers in often very impoverished areas, was originally a New Labour policy under Tony Blair. And it was, as you say, a recipe for disaster. It's an absolute guarantee that there is going to be resentment, because if you've got long-term problems of unemployment, of lack of infrastructure, of lack of investment, and you bring people here who have needs of their own, of course, it's going to cause resentment. So that's not just a Tory issue, it's a Labour issue. I agree that Tories have presented it as an existential threat, but Labour have not resisted that in any meaningful way under the leadership of Keir Starmer. The language around immigration is still very much it's too high. There's too many of them, too many asylum seekers, need to crack down on the small boats. You're not hearing about safe and legal routes. You're not hearing about a fairer and better funded asylum system where people aren't cut off from, other immigrant communities, places where they might have support networks. You're not hearing about giving asylum seekers the right to work so they can support themselves while their claims are being assessed. What you're hearing is, we're going to administer the system more competently than the Tories. That doesn't push back. So there are degrees of responsibility, but there's a huge number of people across politics and media who have participated in this moral panic to greater and lesser degrees. And they have some degree of responsibility, even if it's not as much as the Suella Bravermans of the world.
Let's focus on the media. They are under scrutiny for being overly soft on the rioters, which I think they definitely have at some points. This is how the Telegraph presented the news the day after fascists tried to burn down a hotel with people inside. So you can see here far-right clash with Muslims in rioting. Right? Far-right clash with Muslims in rioting. So there's these two sides, they've clashed. One of them is a political grouping, far-right. The other is just Muslims. There are millions of Muslims in this country. It's just, there's a fight going on between the far-right and the Muslims. It's completely irresponsible framing. And the misleading framing wasn't confined to the right-wing press. This was from a report on BBC Breakfast this morning.
In Bolton, the protest there had been described as a pro-British march online. It started quietly, but soon escalated. Around 300 men ran towards the town hall. They chanted Allahu Akbar, God is great, towards the pro-British demonstrators who hurled back insults.
The Muslims chanted Allahu Akbar while the pro-British protesters hurled back insults. Now, first of all, the rioters aren't protesters, right? They're not protesting things. They're attacking people. And they're not pro-British. They're part of an organised mob that's thrown bricks at mosques, beaten up brown people in the street, and tried to burn down asylum hotels, right? It's not pro-British protesters. As for the Muslim counter-protesters, now they might not have chosen the smartest chant, right? That's not how you get people on your side, really, in this country. But they didn't start this. And they aren't attacking places of worship or members of the public. They're resisting the far right, partly because they see that the police haven't got this under control, right? There's also another false talking point that's framed media coverage over the past weekend, namely the accusation that Britain is subject to two-tier policing. Again, this has come largely via Reform MPs. On Twitter, Nigel Farage said, quote, "Ever since the soft policing of the Black Lives Matter protest, the impression of two-tier policing has become widespread." Again, this is a good get out. You sort of say, oh, it's become widespread. I don't have to say if it's actually happening or not, but it's people are thinking it. People are thinking it. Reform's deputy leader has been spreading flat out misinformation as well to this effect. So he said, like the Hare Hills rioters, so he's sort of responding to Dan Hodges talking about these being rioters. And then he says, how many of them were arrested and charged? We have not been told. Have the Manchester airport thugs been charged with violently assaulting police officers? People are fuming at two-tier policing under instructions from politicians. Now, Richard Tice could have quite easily looked up the answer to those questions. Again, sort of, these things are being hidden from you. Well, if he'd used Google, 27 people were arrested after the Hare Hill riots. 4 have been charged. 22 are on bail with evidence under review. So that's while they're collecting CCTV evidence. 1 has been recalled to prison. All 4 of the people who assaulted the cops at Manchester Airport are on bail while investigations continue. So again, that's going to be looking at CCTV and the like before charges are brought. This is how law enforcement works. Someone who's become frustrated at the accusation of two-tier policing is Met Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley. This happened as he left the Cabinet Office today.
Are we going to end two-tier policing, sir?
And I just want to show you that again, that question from that reporter about two-tier policing. You'll see the Met Police Commissioner grabs the grey implement. That's the microphone. Here it is. And then walks off, other members of the press following him as he walks across the road there to what looks to be the waiting car.
I think he'll probably regret doing that. I don't think the Met have been sort of treating left-wingers more lightly than they are treating right-wingers. For a start, there haven't been any non-right-wing protesters who've been attacking people's homes, places of worship, or hotels, right? I think the police should actually be coming down much harder on these protests than they have at recent ones, because people's lives are being threatened at these, and they haven't been threatened at recent ones, right? So I think he's right to be annoyed at the question. When you are, the most senior police officer in the country, is it a good idea to be picking up someone else's property and throwing it on the floor? Probably not. He might come to regret that. Interestingly, perhaps the person with a really very reasonable response to this all actually has been former Home Secretary Priti Patel. So she said this morning, there's a clear difference between effectively blocking streets or roads being closed to burning down libraries, hotels, food banks, and attacking places of worship. What we have seen is thuggery, violence, racism. Over the last week, we saw the most appalling stabbings in Southport, horrific crimes being committed. We've seen violence and thuggery on the streets. What we saw during the pandemics, this is the BLM protests, we saw protest. We believe in free speech. We saw protests that were being policed. What we're seeing right now is thuggery and disorder and criminality. There is a complete distinction between the two. Priti Patel is, of course, running to be leader of the Conservative Party. Ash, sort of Nigel Farage sort of saying, you treated the BLM protesters with a light touch. Now you're treating these far-right protesters with a heavy-handed response. I think to me it seems patently untrue. But were you surprised that sort of Priti Patel sort of came out and said, actually, the BLM protests and these far-right riots, they're nothing to do with each other?
But I'm going to take one at a time. So just starting with Nigel Farage, it's patently obvious that there isn't a two-tier system of policing. And in fact, what we've seen in recent days, for instance, far-right rioters trying to burn down a hotel with asylum seekers in it, whilst police were just standing there, it shows us that we're not witnessing these hugely heavy-handed crackdowns where public order is being preserved at all costs. Now, I don't know why. I don't know how operational decisions are made within different police forces. Maybe it's because they were overstretched. Maybe they were outnumbered. or maybe there are different rules for policing racists than there are for policing the left. But we didn't see, the kind of very aggressive public order policing that we've seen in different contexts. And I'm not just talking about BLM demonstrations or even the 2011 riots, but also looking at the policing of student protests, back in 2010, 2011. I mean, 327 arrests so far after 6 nights of racially motivated targeting. I mean, you could get that in a single student demo back in the day. So you are seeing a different kind of policing for this. Maybe you'd say, oh, there is a 2-tier system, but it doesn't work in the way that you're thinking. But the far right are trying to spread this so that they can get away with nurturing feelings of resentment and hostility towards traditional figures and institutions of authority, whilst at the same time pretending that they're not whipping up violent disorder. Now, to come to Priti Patel, I mean, you said it yourself, she's running to be Tory party leader. And I think that she is quite a canny politician. If you cast your mind back to 2021, when the English football team were playing in the Euros and taking the knee just before kickoff, Priti Patel was saying that the far right effectively had the right to boo their own nation's footballers. At the last Tory party conference, so this would have been last October, she was literally dancing around with Nigel Farage. They were having a good old boogie on the dance floor. I think what she's realised is that space on the hard right of the Conservative Party is very crowded. Of course, you've got Robert Jenrick, you've got Kemi Badenoch. You have no shortage of Conservative MPs who will want to pitch themselves as effectively a reform-style leader for the Tory party. There's comparatively few people who both have some serious hard right credentials. You know, they're not a Jeremy Hunt type figure. They're not, a Cameroon, as they used to call them, but also can maybe appeal to that middle section of what you might call more moderate Tory MPs. So that's where Priti Patel is trying to occupy that space. It's not because she's got this, deep sense of morality which has suddenly been troubled. I mean, maybe she has, but that's not the incentive that's operating here. It's purely party political.
While Britain's streets are in chaos, the seeds were sown online. Toby Robinson has been blamed for fanning the flames of far-right violence. He was previously banned from Twitter for violating its rules over hateful conduct. However, that all changed when Elon Musk bought the social media platform. The billionaire reinstated Robinson in November 2023, along with other far-right figures such as Katie Hopkins. Since then, Robinson has been back spouting disinformation and whipping up hatred, and he has in fact directly credited Musk with his revival. Here he is speaking to US-based conspiracy theorist Alex Jones on InfoWars.
I've been in this activism for 15 years, so whilst people feel that our country's in a very, very dark place, I've never felt the enthusiasm that I feel now. Everywhere I go, people who hated me are now supporters. People who realise they've been lied to, the trust in the media has gone. The monopoly and the power that they had to deceive the public about us has gone. Okay, it's gone. Partly thanks to Elon Musk. Elon Musk has opened us back up, gave a voice for reality, a voice for the truth, gave us back a platform where people can share the outrageous decisions the police are making, share the horrific, terrible stories of what's happening in towns and cities across the country. And in the last few months, I'd say you've seen the brewing of a mini revolution in Great Britain.
Musk's own statements about the far-right riots are really extreme. Here you've got libs of TikTok sharing a video of riots in Britain. Someone says the effects of mass migration and open borders is what's going on. Elon Musk says civil war is inevitable. This is, he's sometimes the first or the second most richest person in the world. He thinks civil war is coming to Britain, obviously owns one of the most important social media platforms. Downing Street criticised the comments, saying there is no justification for comments like that. Robinson is out of the country, having absconded to avoid contempt of court proceedings. While migrant hotels are under attack, Robinson is in a luxury hotel reclining on a sunbed in a 5-star hotel in Cyprus. This was the headline of the Daily Mail today. Stoking race riots from his sunbed. Former English Defence League leader Tommy Robinson relaxes in five-star Cyprus resort while fueling violence across UK with inflammatory online posts. Robinson, meanwhile, had this to say: "My kids are crying. We come here so I could spend some quality time with them. Now they are scared people are coming here to get them. The Daily Mail has purposely doxed the exact location of my family. How can they be allowed to do this?" So this is Tommy Robinson who's saying, I'm in a hotel with my family and I'm worried because people might attack me. Meanwhile, his supporters are literally setting fire to hotels in the north of England containing lots of asylum seekers. Right? You couldn't make this up. This isn't just about Tommy Robinson, however. Anti-fascist researchers and counter-extremism experts are calling the new form of far-right organising the networked far-right. High-profile influencers stoke tensions in public, but the riots are organised on Telegram groups out of the public view. There are 13,000 members on one Telegram channel organising riots for Wednesday. Some of the messages being posted glory in violent fantasies. Anti-fascist research group Red Flare said this: "The Telegram group was started in the wake of the Southport attack and has grown rapidly. It appears to represent the mainstreaming of terrorgram content in the British far right, with neo-Nazi terrorist content being shared with a wider audience of anti-migrant rioters." Ash, how significant do you think sort of Elon Musk buying Twitter has been? The organisation of these riots is complicated. It's happening on Telegram. Lots of it is happening in places we can't see. But it does seem, there's quite an easy sort of narrative to present whereby Elon Musk buys Twitter. He clearly has far-right ideologies. He lets Tommy Robinson back, or Stephen Yaxley Lennon back onto Twitter. He has hundreds of thousands of followers, constantly sort of tweeting misinformation and inciting riots. And then you have far-right riots, right? So it's, on one level, it's a simplistic narrative. At the same time, it seems like something that can't really be ignored.
I mean, there is truth in it. You have many accounts on Twitter which have set themselves up as kind of quasi-respectable far-right influencers who are able to pump out misinformation, outright lies about the identity of the Southport attacker, misrepresenting footage of British Asians who are, what you might say, counter-protesting or defending their communities. This stuff can circulate on Twitter, but where it becomes really powerful is when those screenshots and videos and that framing of images makes it onto Telegram. One thing I'll say about the experience of being a Twitter user of colour is that since Elon Musk has taken over, racism is very, very bad. I don't even know if there's like an acceptable way to say this, but just today, I was being racially abused by someone with the screen name N-word raper, except it didn't say N-word, it said the full name. I had a look at the account and it was full of images of swastikas. Now, someone with a slur in their Twitter handle ordinarily wouldn't have been allowed to have that as a Twitter handle at all back in the day when Twitter was still called Twitter and not called X. There were people who had, rather unfortunate surnames who weren't allowed to have their surname as part of their Twitter handle because it was considered an obscenity and just sort of picked up automatically by the system. So clearly, the rules around content moderation have changed to an extent that people who have one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to set up accounts with the most egregious racism and neo-Nazi ideology possible, are getting through whatever the content moderation system is, if they've got one. That has a huge impact in terms of having this sort of feedback loop between street racism and online racism. The stronger one gets, the more emboldened the other one feels. And that does make, I think, a real difference. When we're talking about the contemporary far right and how they organize, you have to think in terms of social media networks. Think more about how social media contagion works rather than a sort of organized party form. That's both the far right's greatest strength, that stochastic element The fact it's very loosely networked, you don't have these, big central organizations. What you have are platforms and networks of people corralled into one place. That's a strength for them, clearly. It allows them to cause huge amounts of disruption. The weakness is, of course, when they do start contesting elections and they're having to draw from this pool of radicalized people for their candidates. They turn out to have said some egregiously racist stuff, and then those candidates have to step down. But that's how the far right work, and that's an important thing to bear in mind.
The far-right riots that have swept the UK are, rightly and understandably, deeply concerning to British Muslims. But when one of the most high-profile Muslim MPs entered the Good Morning Britain studio this morning, her concerns weren't taken seriously.
Keir Starmer, Yvette Cooper and Rishi Sunak over the weekend have all said that...
have they called it Islamophobic and racist?
Why
is that language important? Because these aren't trivial matters.
They've called it racist. Have they called it racist?
These are not trivial matters. We have to...
No, I know. No, I'm sorry. We do have to ask you questions as well.
Absolutely.
So
and if you want to, you can answer them.
I'm going to wait for Kate to finish her question, if that's...
If you want to answer the questions, you can, but you don't have to.
So why is it important to you to use that specific word, Islamophobic? It's been called racist, it's been called thuggery. I think that's important because we are speaking to the Home Secretary and other politicians this morning. Why does that matter to you to use the word Islamophobic?
In Stockport, a mosque was targeted, bricks were thrown out. The people who were in the mosque at that time, who were basically locked down in that mosque, said that they feared for their life.
But
they
Keir
weren't able to
Starmer
get
has
out. I'm just finishing the question.
I did ask specifically about the word,
if that's
sorry,
okay.
Yeah.
I would also say that the role of...
I was interrupting you. He sort of says at the end, oh, no, I was interrupting you. That's what I was doing. That's fine. That's my job. What? That was, as I said, right, this is a situation which is incredibly, incredibly worrying for especially Muslim people, all people of colour in the country, but especially Muslim people, because it's mosques that are being attacked, right? And it's sort of really Islamophobic rioters who were taken to the streets. And he can't let her finish an answer. He's not even just interrupting Zarah Sultana. He's interrupting his own co-host, right? His co-host can't finish a question to Zarah Sultana because he keeps butting in. Like, it's really, really bizarre, really, really disrespectful. And you'll also notice that when Ed Balls was repeatedly interrupting Zarah Sultana and his own co-host, he was doing so to defend the government, right? He was saying, no, but Keir Starmer has said this, Keir Starmer has said that, saying, well, I think the government's doing okay, actually. Now, you might say he has a bit of a conflict of interest there because, if you didn't know already, his wife is the Home Secretary. Right? Ed Balls' wife is the Home Secretary. Clearly, though, ITV don't care about conflicts of interest because this happened later on Good Morning Britain.
There have been identifiable individuals on social media who have been inciting not just riot, but violence. They've been using racist language. They've been using falsehoods about what happened in Southport. This is happening on the social media platforms. What can be done, what should be done now by the social media companies and the police and the government to stop this happening? Because it's been happening for a week.
Well, you're right, Ed, that we have seen these things that are appearing online that are clearly criminal.
You're right, Ed. Yeah, you're right, Ed. I agree with that. You literally had breakfast together. Ash, I want your comments on this. You got Zarah Sultana, who goes into the studio. I think Ed Balls was really, really disrespectful there. And then he's defending the government. His wife is a part of it. And then he gives his wife a really soft interview. Like, what? How has this been allowed to happen?
You know what? It's just laughable, isn't it? It's just laughable. It's such an open display of a corrupt and dysfunctional media that a former Labour minister who's married to a current Labour minister can sit there and harangue a Labour MP who's in a sort of is a political opponent, an internal political opponent of his wife, can talk over her, can sneer at her, can treat her really disrespectfully, even though she's on to talk about racism and she's the only person of colour in the studio at the time. And then he can go, and now over to my wife, who I'm going to interview, and we're going to do this thing where we pretend not to know each other. A functioning media would not allow this to happen. And in a way, I'm not even angry at Ed Balls, all right? He's only able to behave in this way because the system of media has enabled him to do so. I'm angry with ITV. I'm angry with Good Morning Britain because they had a look at what in any other context context you would see as a flagrant conflict of interest, then I went, yeah, good TV, that's fine.
Let's go back to the debate between Zarah Sultana and Ed Balls. I think Ash and I might have some disagreements on the next one.
I would also say that the role
you.
of the Labour Party historically through New Labour, the controls on immigration, mugs, and also your article in The Guardian where you said the problem with Labour is that they have accepted too many Eastern European migrants. We have to look at all of this historically over at least 2-3 decades when we look at the role.
I was totally right in that article.
So the discussion around immigration, you don't see that playing a role in what we're seeing descend across the country. You don't think there's any complicity in that at all?
I think if you fail to control and manage immigration properly, then things go wrong.
So the language that protesters...
So you have to control and manage immigration?
Rather than far-right mobs and
you believe in controlling and managing it?
The language that they're using are stop the boats. They are telling people like me to go home. If we look at the language used by politicians and the language used by these people in these streets, you will see a direct correlation.
But you've moved from attacking Andrew to attacking me, so let me have a go.
The Kate asked me about language, okay.
What you can't do is just spray out attacks on all of us and then not have any comeback. You didn't answer Andrew's question.
No, she didn't.
You attacked me. I wrote an article in which I said it was important to control and manage migration. You agree with that?
What I'm saying is, when we're talking about migration...
I'm asking you a question. You've got to answer it.
I am answering it.
Do you agree in controlling and managing migration?
I think we need to talk about migration in a way that humanises people who have to migrate. And the levels of the debate, the levels it has stooped, has meant that people are setting fire to hotels that are housing asylum seekers.
But do you agree in controlling and managing it?
When we look at the impact of language used, we need to look at how it affects people in our communities and in our streets. In Tamworth, a hotel housing asylum seekers has been set alight. That has happened also in the north. And I think we need to really be careful about the language we use. And just going back to Kate's question,
I'm asking a really simple question. Do you think it's important for governments to control and manage migration?
I think having an immigration policy which is fair, which recognises that we need migration to staff our NHS, to staff our social care crisis with an ageing population, I think we need to have really responsible language. And just answering Kate's question...
I don't know.
Can I answer Kate's?
Now, I have mixed feelings about this. I think, first of all, it's worth saying the way Zarah was treated in that interview was really gross. I think when you're in the midst of a situation where you've got anti-Muslim riots across the country, just having 3 white men sort of snigger as a young Muslim MP sort of speaks very passionately, I think is completely inappropriate, really, really gross. I think the way she was treated was awful. I also do think, though, that there is a danger of the left sort of saying, we've got these far-right riots. Anyone who's ever argued that immigration should be lower than it currently is therefore implicated. This was the article, by the way, she was referring to, Ed Balls. We were wrong to allow so many Eastern Europeans into Britain. It's essential there is a debate on what restrictions on unskilled labour mobility are needed in enlarging Europe. In that article, he did sort of say, migration has been very important for the NHS. It has been important for cultural diversity. It's also created some problems. And I mean, the argument was that Labour should have had the same provisional controls that sort of Germany had when it came to EU expansion. Ash, I want your opinions on this. I tweeted something to this effect today, and it's sort of divided opinion, let's say, because I do think there is a danger of the left saying these far-right rioters are terrible, which obviously they are, and also anyone who has ever said that migration should be lower is therefore implicated. And the danger, I think, with that is that you are then lumping in a huge proportion of the population with the far right. And I think you want to isolate the far right, not say, oh, the far right are terrible, and by the way, all of you are guilty too. What's your response?
Well, I think that there's a difference between comms and strategic comms and what the truth is. Strategically, it is probably more useful to isolate the far right, create the sense of a much bigger we and an us, which, isolates them and says that you're not representative of the entire country. You're not representative of the political mainstream at all. However, what the truth is that there are these threads of connection, both in terms of organizations and networks and think tanks and journalists, and also discourses and ideas and narratives that exist between the mainstream and the far right on the issue of immigration, and immigration as a vehicle for racist ideas and racist ideology. And I'm afraid to say that New Labour was deeply implicated. in this. David Blunkett, as Home Secretary, collaborated with the Sun newspaper to drive what was called an asylum week, which was a week of planned out attack pieces on the front page of the newspaper, demonizing asylum seekers, making it out to be this huge uncontrolled problem. Also, at the end of the week, David Blunkett could swoop in with a planned op-ed promising another crackdown. Now, did that at the time weaken the far right? Did that mean that they had the wind taken out of their sails because it was an issue being owned and claimed by the mainstream? No. What followed was the BNP having their most successful local election showing ever. And if you listened to what BNP activists were saying at the time, they said, well, actually, Labour gave us a gift because we were going around knocking on doors with the mainstream issue at the time. And the reason why I also know this is because I recently wrote a chapter on this. That's why I've not been around very much, because I was finishing my book. During that period, in the early 2000s, you saw in cities like Peterborough, which had become the focal point of tabloid attention, always the setting of these asylum scare stories. You had politicians weighing in saying how terrible it all was. What followed was you had acts of racist violence being carried out against asylum seekers and those who were perceived as asylum seekers. So, Michael, I can definitely see the argument that strategically the thing that you want to do in this moment is isolate the far right. But I do think that the truth is that there has been a nurturing of the far right, not deliberately. I think that, you know, Labour politicians would have thought they were weakening the far right by trying to claim some anti-immigration turf, but ultimately it helped bolster their credibility in talking about immigration, because they're saying, okay, well, everyone agrees this is a problem. Those guys in power aren't doing anything about it. Everyone thinks immigration should be lower, but they're in the government. They're not doing anything about it. So, you know, we should have some pogroms. We should say, you know, mass repatriation, mass deportations, you know, along the lines of race and ethnicity. And so I think the way in which you have a better conversation about immigration is that you have a conversation about immigration which is rooted in an economic context, which is rooted in the weakening of collective bargaining and organized labor in this country. Because if what you wanted to do is say, okay, it's really unacceptable that you've got these low paid migrants, and in certain sectors, that means that you've got the normalization of low wages for everybody. You could say, all right, well, what we're going to do is introduce sectoral bargaining. We're going to introduce fair pay agreements, which don't just, you know, cover individual workplaces, which is what trade unions are allowed to do now. It can extend to the entirety of agriculture, of hospitality, of the care sector. What if we do that, rather than demonizing people who've come here to work for these, you know, sectors and organizations and contribute to society? What if we did that? You offer people a real choice about how to address these issues of low wage, precarious work, rather than just going, oh, why don't we grab that, you know, that dial that has migration on it and turn it down? You never actually turn the migration down, by the way. You just turn the hatred against migrants up.
I suppose I take a lot of your points. I suppose what I don't really understand, and where I think the left are at a risk of sort of ending up lumping everyone with the far right, is if the majority of the country I think it's about 50-50 now, but for a very long time, the majority of the country have mainly voted for parties that want to reduce migration, right? And then they haven't, which has been a big, you know, I think the worst of both worlds is saying you're going to do it and then not doing it. But how do you think it would be legitimate and acceptable for a politician or a voter to say that actually we would like migration to be reduced? Now, I'm fine with migration at the levels they are. I mean, I think, you know, the fact that net migration is sort of double what it used to be is going to cause some strains on public services probably. But do you think that it's always illegitimate to say, well, maybe we should just have lower levels of migration, or should it always be, no, we can have unlimited levels of migration and any problems means we should just build more houses? Because I suppose I think the problem is if you say ever having an opinion on migration, which is it should be lower, is therefore feeding the far right, just makes a lot of people far right when I don't think they necessarily deserve to be tarred with that brush.
I suppose I just don't think that I am saying, oh, it's illegitimate to hold an anti-immigration opinion. What I'm talking about is the effects of newspaper writers, journalists, think tank people, politicians, and ministers consistently feeding an anti-immigration narrative. I'm not here to, find a random Tory voter on the street and be like, wow, you're so bad, you're so racist. I don't think that that convinces people. I think the way you do that is you make a positive case for immigration within the context of greater wealth redistribution, of more building, of greater investment, and all of those things. I really am not interested in policing individuals' opinions. What I'm interested in doing is identifying the consequences of politicians' activities. The issue is that whenever you do that and you say, you as a politician have fed into this problem that you're now decrying, it gets interpreted as, but you're calling ordinary people racist. No, what I'm saying is that the thing that the politician has done has had racist consequences. And I think that's an important distinction.
Well, I suppose if you were a Labour leadership candidate who thought that immigration had been too high, I mean, how should you express that? Or you just think
they clearly express it. They clearly express it fairly well. I'm not in the business of shutting them down and saying, okay, well, it's against the rules. Like, you've gone across.
But how would they express it in a way that wouldn't get them blamed for pogroms?
Well, because the thing is that I think that anti-immigration politics has its origins in racism in this country. I do think that. I think that we have a kind of straight line. I think we've got a straight line going from Enoch Powell to the anti-immigration discourses of today. Now, that is not my only argument against these people. I make the argument about economics, and I make the argument about staffing in the NHS, and I make the argument about demographic aging. I make all these other arguments. But it feels to me a little bit like what you're saying is, well, you can't be really interested in political contestation unless you contort yourself into a position where you say it's okay if this one Labour politician says it. Not saying it's not okay, saying it has racist consequences.
Yeah, I suppose and where Ed Balls was going with the argument is sort of, because to say, I think that the left-wing position, which seems to me to either be sort of no borders or a bit inconsistent, because, so at the moment, say migration is 600,000 or whatever, why is it racist to say it should be 300,000? But say someone else says it should be 1 million, and you say, well, probably it shouldn't be 1 million, it should be 700. At what point does the numbers become racist, or are you just saying you're going to leave that to the bad guys to work out? Because what separates, I suppose, your position from open borders, and why is your position not racist, whereas someone who wants migration to be at 500,000 instead of 800,000 is being racist?
But I just think that you're creating a straw man. What you're creating is a straw man who's saying, well, look, it's just about numbers, and I don't really care where these people come from. It is never just the number that's being mobilized. It's always the place and the people as well. So if you can find me a politician who has said, okay, it's just straight numbers. We're just having a conversation about numbers and the labor market, and that's it. I don't mind whether they come from Australia or Canada or Romania or Somalia, right? Fine. But you're not going to find those politicians. So I think that there's a bit of straw manning going on, Michael.
I mean, I think that kind of was obviously you said Eastern Europeans in the headline, but that's because that was the migration that came in those years because it was in the EU. But we'll end there. It's very interesting always to end on these debates, unless you want to say something else.
Yeah, you're a prick, Michael. No, I'm joking.
All right. Pleasure as always. This is going to be a big story for the next week. So do keep tuning in. Let's wrap up there. Thank you everyone for watching this evening, and we'll be back tomorrow from 6 p.m. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.